Devil's Shoemaker, featuring Joseph Lee Brenner Kallinger III. Crimes and sprees. Joseph Kallinger was known to commit 3 murders in total, also taking their lives. His crime and murders, majority of the time, would operate in several states in the United States. The murder spree itself lasted from July of the year 1974 to January of the year 1975. Specifically, Joseph Kallinger would terrorize families across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey. It was noted every murder involved Joseph Kallinger along with his accomplice who dress up as a salesman, then gaining their trust of the people around before getting inside their flats. Once inside the flats, Joseph Kallinger would tie them up and then engage in varieties of abuse. The abusements would include physical abuse, sexual abuse, and robbery, in other words, stealing their belongings. Tragically, other than people he did not know, he would even murder his own son to commit with his beliefs. Speaking of beliefs, reportedly from Joseph Kallinger himself, he would claim he heard voices from God, specifically telling him to commit murders and sacrifice people to God. In addition, he also claimed he would become God if he murdered everyone in global Earth. Overall, the serial killings involved his beliefs in severe mental illnesses or untreated medical conditions. Investigation. The investigation for the case of Joseph Kallinger involved intense, multi-state manhunt along with mistakes from the police. It was noted even before Joseph Kallinger had started his murder spree, he was known to commit other crimes, including insurance fraud and child abuse towards his own children, aside from the fact he'd murdered his own son. Reportedly, there was a survivor, a witness really, victim Maria Fasching's friend, who escaped and offered the police to help. However, the police would dismiss and miss the opportunity, leading to investigation becoming slightly longer, an increase in time. In addition, there was a public witness who saw both Joseph Kallinger and his son wearing blood-stained clothes riding in the public bus. In the while, on searching for the home invaders and the killers, the investigators in Philadelphia would hunt Kallinger for another reason, which included the fact that his 13-year-old son, Joseph Kallinger Jr., had went missing. In addition, it was noted Joseph would also commit insurance fraud along with taking the life of his own son. Police departments from Pennsylvania and New Jersey had worked together, leading to arrest and raid, and specifically the apartment of Joseph Kallinger above his shoe store on January 17, 1975. Trial and court proceedings. Following the arrest, Joseph Kallinger was identified by survivors along with witnesses at the police station, leading to the survivors testifying as witnesses during the trial and court proceedings. The trial and court proceedings for the case of Joseph Kallinger mainly focused on whether he was sane or insane, rather than attempting to make him confess he did the murders. Matter of fact, he would confess, and there were a significant amount of evidences against him, and that would prove that he committed the murders. Anyways, Joseph Kallinger during the trial was not stable. In fact, he would frequently attempt to attack the viewers, sheriffs, deputies, and witnesses. He would reportedly even attempt to attack the jury and the judge during the court or in the courtroom. In one of the sources, it had mentioned Joseph Kallinger had violently bitten his chair, leading to the piece of wood tearing out of the chair. In addition, in one of the attacks, Joseph would attack the deputy and the sheriff with a shattered piece of glass he pulled out from his pocket. It was highly difficult for the prosecutors difficult time for the prosecutors to prove Joseph Kallinger was sane during the murders due to the outbursts and severely negative records of his mental illnesses or medical records. Joseph himself would even claim in court he was 1,000 years old and had lived as a butterfly before he became a human. Oh, he was a human in his human life. Trial and Court Proceedings, Part 2. From the medical records given to the court, it showed Joseph Kallinger reportedly had an IQ of 82. In addition, there were horrifyingly disturbing details about his brutal childhood, and Joseph had suffered from severe inhalation towards the strong and dangerous chemicals. Not only did the survivors testify against Joseph Kallinger, however, aside from his accomplice, his other children would testify, standing as witnesses, and reporting that Joseph Kallinger would often lock them in basements. In addition, brutally torture and abuse them, similar to how the adopted parents of Joseph did to him when he was a child, or his childhood years. There were 3 separate trials for the case of Joseph Kallinger. First one in Pennsylvania, the second in New Jersey, and the third once again in Pennsylvania. Ultimately, Joseph Kallinger was sentenced to multiple life sentences, plus up to 131 additional years in prison. Childhood. The childhood of Joseph Kallinger was heavily dysfunctional, abusive, and dark-like religious household, and both physically, emotionally abusive. Joseph Kallinger, as a baby, was abandoned by his parents, placing him in foster care by the year of 1937, leading to him never seeing his biological parents ever again. In 1939, though, the Kallinger family would adopt Joseph into their homes, specifically Stephen Kallinger and Anna Kallinger, Austrian immigrants. Reportedly in the household, Joseph would be severely beaten by both adoptive parents, specifically being punched, whipped by a belt, hit with wooden spoons, and locked inside dark closets. Reportedly in one of the occasions, his adoptive mother had struck him in the head with a severely large hammer just because Joseph Kallinger desired to be a normal child and requested to go to a school trip. In another occasion, his adoptive parents would force Joseph Kallinger to put his hands inside a burning stove, leading to his hands being damaged severely. At age 6, Joseph Kallinger was told by his parents he needed to do surgery and go to the doctor for his testicles. However, in one of the sources it mentioned during the doctor's appointment, the doctors would severely punch the testicles of Joseph Kallinger as his adoptive parents had watched and laughed. It is unknown whether following his doctor's visit, if he had permanent damage in his private areas or not. Childhood, Part 2. Other than home life and school life or social life, Joseph Kallinger was heavily isolated from surrounding peers. In addition, he was reportedly bullied severely physically from other students. In fact, it was mentioned in one of the occasions a group of boys had sexually assaulted him in the alley. After school, every single day, Joseph's adoptive father would force Joseph Kallinger to work with him in the shoe store, specifically exposing him to severely dangerous chemicals, along with making shoes from scratch. One day, though, when Joseph Kallinger was 15 years old, he got tired of being abused, leading to him running away. Personal life, potentially affecting their crimes and acts. Following Joseph Kallinger running away from his home, from his adoptive parents' life, he would reportedly get married in such early age. However, due to his trauma and untreated medical conditions, the personal life of Joseph Kallinger would not be positive. In fact, it would be a replica of his childhood. Joseph Kallinger was first married to a female named Hilda Bergan, whom they would have 2 children together. However, they would divorce on the year of 1958 because of the abusive behavior Joseph demonstrates. Soon after, Joseph Kallinger would marry to another female named Elizabeth Betty DeLuca, whom they would have 5 children, specifically 3 sons and 2 daughters together. Even in his personal life, he was socially isolated from society, leading to him having no friends. Tragically, he would abuse his children the same way he was abused by his adoptive parents. Job-wise, he would work as a master shoemaker and a cobbler for his matter of fact the rest of his adult life until he gets arrested for his crimes. By the people around, he would actually be dubbed as Crazy Joe due to the instability in his life and his behaviors. The shoe shop was located at 100 East Sterner Street in Philadelphia. His family actually lived in an apartment directly above the shop. Pivotal events. Joseph Lee Brenner Kallinger III was born on the 11th of December, 1935 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. On 1937, Joseph was abandoned by his biological parents. On 1939, Joseph was adopted by Stephen Kallinger and Anna Kallinger. On 1950, Joseph Kallinger would run away from home to get married to Hilda Bergman. On 1958, Joseph would be forced to divorce Hilda. On April of 1958, Joseph married his second wife, Elizabeth Betty DeLuca. On 1972, Joseph Kallinger would abuse his children along with setting his first arson as an adult. On the summer of 1974, his murder spree would begin. From the year of 1974 to 1975, Joseph Kallinger and his accomplice would travel to 3 different states. Joseph Kallinger was arrested on January 17, 1975 in Philadelphia. On 1975, Joseph Kallinger would have his first trial in Pennsylvania. On 1976, Joseph Kallinger would have his second trial in New Jersey. On 1984, Joseph Kallinger would have his third and final trial in Pennsylvania. On the year of 1984, his trial and court proceedings, in simple words, his sentence would finalize. Quotes from Joseph Lee Brenner Kallinger III. I'd like to be a great poet. I'm trying in my poetry to give chaos form. I was only following God's orders. Yes, I do. Killing people. Yes. Well, last March 11th, I was hallucinating and I took a razor blade and I cut a man's throat. Yes, it is. I hope I never do either. I'm a patient person with a good ear and helping people. He was a sacrifice for one to murder 3 million people of planet Earth. He was a sacrifice to see if I could murder one of my own. Charlie commanded me to sever the young boy's testicles and genitals. Forensic inferences. The case, as well as the murders of Joseph Kallinger, was heavily driven by severely negative childhood, along with his personal life and untreated medical conditions or mental state. Joseph Kallinger, rather than killing for hate, his schizophrenia conditions or hallucinations may have likely driven him to murder. However, he himself was likely already used to the violent killings or the violent atmosphere. While as a child, he was not killed or murdered by his adoptive parents. During the abusement, his adoptive parents had made to him. He mentally, despite the pain, he got used to the killings and the violent atmosphere his adoptive parents would provide. Joseph likely knew what was right and wrong. However, whatever was in his head, he likely wanted to commit with it, or he thought he was meant to commit with it. It isn't necessarily the mindset of, if I have to suffer, everyone does. For the case of Joseph Kallinger, it is more of a schedule-like project to him. Though the project inside of his head, the killings, was a large goal for him. However, the voices were likely true in his head. He likely did hear some sort of voice due to his mental state. For his methods, he likely kept note from his parents' abuse, using it not only to his victims, but would even practice it towards his own children. He may have felt skeptical at first. However, he likely prioritized his killings tragically more than he prioritized his children or family. In a way, his family and shoemaker life was a barrier for him to not get caught. However, his case was definitely not the most calculating case. It was more of a cult-like rampage, though it was both similar and different from the case of Charles Manson. Overall, his killings was a combination of his mental state, childhood, and the chemicals he likely consumed inside of his head when doing his shoemaking job. Legacy and impact. The case of Joseph Lee Brenner Kallinger III was considered to be one of the most difficult court cases to prove he was sane during the murders. The case of Joseph had led to the New Jersey laws tighten the laws of insanity versus sanity. People began to debate whether the dismembered head, Charlie, in the mind of Joseph Kallinger was real or not. Joseph Kallinger was added as another identity and perspective towards serial killers. People began to produce books from the case of Joseph Kallinger such as the Shoemaker from 1983. Till this day, the case of Joseph Kallinger tells people how bad the effects could be from child abuse and negative childhood.